He tested his fiancée in disguise, then fell for the woman who doubted him, 1965. The autumn of 1965 painted Ashford, Kentucky in shades of rust and gold, the kind of beauty that made people forget how small their worlds had become. Main Street still had a 5 and dime, where Mrs. Peterson knew everyone's shoe size, and the Methodist church bell marked time more reliably than any wristwatch. It was the kind of town where a man's word meant everything, and a broken engagement could follow a family for generations. Thomas Garrett understood this better than most. At 28, he stood to inherit Garrett Manufacturing, the textile mill that employed half the county. His engagement to Caroline Whitmore had been announced in the Ashford Gazette 6 months prior, complete with a photograph of them standing beside her father's Cadillac, both smiling with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being watched. Caroline came from old money. Her great-grandfather had owned the land the mill now sat on. Their union made sense on paper, in checkbooks, in the carefully maintained ledgers of small-town aristocracy. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline saw him the same way she saw that Cadillac, expensive, reliable, good for appearances. He wanted to believe their love was real, but doubt had planted itself in his mind like a weed, growing wild through sleepless nights. If you're enjoying this story, I'd love it if you could subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I read every single comment. Now, let's get back to Thomas and the choice that would change his life forever. The idea came to him on a Tuesday evening in late September, sitting in his father's study while rain drummed against the windows. His father had been dead 2 years, but Thomas still couldn't bring himself to change anything in this room. The same green banker's lamp, the same leather chair cracked at the armrests, the same portrait of his grandfather glowering from above the fireplace. He'd been reading his father's journals, trying to find some wisdom about marriage, about certainty, about how you know when something is real. Instead, he found a passage from 1938. Tested Margaret today by sending flowers with no card. She assumed they were from Bradford. I know the truth now. Thomas read it 3 times, his heart beating faster with each pass. His mother had nearly married Bradford Sullivan before choosing his father. He'd never known there had been a test, a moment of verification disguised as chance. The idea took root immediately, terrible and compelling in equal measure. He would become someone else. Someone without the Garrett name, without the mill, without the money. He would meet Caroline fresh, see if she recognized something true beneath the trappings. If their love was real, she would feel it. If it wasn't, well, better to know now than wake up at 50 in a marriage built on social contracts and quarterly profits. The plan took shape over the following week. Thomas grew a beard, which changed his face more than he'd expected, adding years and a roughness his clean-shaven reflection had never known. He bought work clothes from the Sears catalogue, denim that stiffened his movements, flannel that smelled of sizing and newness. He borrowed his groundskeeper's truck, a battered Ford with a temperamental clutch, and he invented a name, Jack Morrison, a carpenter looking for work, new in town from eastern Kentucky where the coal mines were closing, and men like him had to follow opportunity wherever it led. The transformation felt like stepping into cold water, shocking and total. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The beard helped, but it was more than that. The set of his shoulders changed when he wore those clothes. His voice dropped half an octave, his gait slowed. Jack Morrison moved through the world differently than Thomas Garrett, and the difference felt dangerously freeing. He chose the Bluebird Diner for their first meeting. Caroline volunteered there every Wednesday afternoon, serving coffee to the workers who couldn't afford the country club where she usually took her meals. It was her charity work, the kind of thing that looked good in the society pages. Thomas had always admired it, but now he wondered, did she see the men she served as human or as opportunities for grace? He walked into the Bluebird at 2:30 on a Wednesday, the lunch rush fading into the afternoon lull. The bell above the door chimed, and Caroline looked up from behind the counter, her honey-blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, a white apron covering her blue dress. She was beautiful. He'd always known that, but today he tried to see her as a stranger would. She had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers, symmetrical and cool, with pale blue eyes that revealed nothing. "Sit anywhere," she said, not quite smiling. Her voice had that practiced pleasantness he'd heard her use with service people, warm enough to seem kind, but distant enough to maintain boundaries. He took a booth near the window, where October light slanted through the glass and made squares on the formica. Caroline approached with a pot of coffee, filling his cup without asking. Up close he could smell her perfume. White shoulders, the same she'd worn at their engagement party. "New in town?" she asked, and he realized she truly didn't recognize him. Relief and disappointment tangled in his chest. "Just arrived," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended, shaped by Jack Morrison's invented past. "Looking for construction work. Heard there might be opportunities here." "There's always something," Caroline said, glancing toward the kitchen. "Mills expanding. Housing development going up near the highway. What kind of work do you do?" "Carpentry, mostly. Framing, finish work. Whatever pays." He watched her face, looking for some flicker of recognition, but found only polite interest. "You from around here?" "Born and raised," she said, and there was something in her tone, pride or resignation, he couldn't tell. "Ashford's not much, but it's home. You want pie? We have apple and cherry today." "Apple," he said, though he wasn't hungry. He just wanted her to stay longer, to talk, to give him something to believe in. She brought the pie and lingered, wiping the already clean counter beside his booth. The diner was nearly empty now, just an old man reading the paper by the door and two teenage girls sharing a milkshake. The radio played softly, the Supremes singing about baby love. "What brings you to Ashford specifically?" Caroline asked, and he heard genuine curiosity beneath the politeness. "Honestly, needed a fresh start." He let truth bleed into the lie, making it stronger. "Sometimes you have to leave behind who you were to figure out who you're supposed to be." Something shifted in her expression, a small crack in the pleasant facade. "I understand that," she said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. I imagine that must be difficult." Before he could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Harold, the owner, called out, "Caroline, honey, your mother's on the phone. Says it's important." Caroline's face tightened. "Thank you, Harold." She turned back to Thomas, to Jack, with an apologetic smile. "Enjoy your pie. Let me know if you need anything else." He watched her go, noticing how her shoulders tensed as she picked up the phone behind the counter. He couldn't hear her words, but he recognized the tone, dutiful, strained, the voice of someone explaining themselves. When she hung up, she didn't return to his booth. Thomas left money on the table and walked out into the afternoon. The October air smelled of wood smoke and coming cold. He climbed into the borrowed truck, hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. What had he expected? That she would see through his disguise with the clarity of true love? That seemed suddenly childish, the stuff of fairy tales and his mother's romance novels. But something else nagged at him, the moment when she'd said, "I understand that." The crack in her voice. The suggestion that Caroline Whitmore, who had never wanted for anything, who had been groomed since birth to marry well and live comfortably, might also feel trapped by her own life. He came back the next Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. Each time, he sat in the same booth, ordered coffee and pie, and talked to Caroline in fragments, the way strangers do, revealing small truths that somehow feel safer than the large ones. He learned that she'd wanted to study art in college, but her father had insisted on finishing school instead, that she painted in secret, landscapes mostly, though she'd never shown them to anyone. That she volunteered at the diner, not because it looked good in the papers, but because she liked feeling useful, like her hands could do something real. And he told her about Jack Morrison's life, inventing details that felt more honest than his real biography. A father who died in the mines, a mother who taught him to find beauty in small things, dreams of building something with his own hands that would outlast him. The lies revealed truths he'd never spoken as Thomas Garrett. By the fourth Wednesday, something had changed between them. Caroline saved his booth for him, even when the diner got crowded. She brought him coffee before he asked. Once, when she laughed at something he said, a story about supposedly fixing a roof upside down because he'd read the blueprints wrong, he saw her cover her mouth with her hand, surprised by the sound of her own joy. "I shouldn't," she said, though she was still smiling. "Shouldn't what?" "Laugh." "Be so familiar with customers," she said, but she didn't move away from his booth. "It's not proper." "Since when do you care about proper?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, too intimate for Jack Morrison to ask, too knowing. Caroline's smile faded. She looked at him carefully, really looked, and for a terrible moment he thought she'd recognized him. But then she said, "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know you spend Wednesday afternoons in a diner serving coffee to men your family probably wouldn't invite to dinner. I know you hide paintings in a back room somewhere. I know you're not as content as you pretend to be." Her face went pale, then flushed. "You should go." "Caroline, please." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she picked up his empty cup. "Just go." He left, but the damage was done. Or perhaps the truth was finally surfacing. He drove home to the Garrett house on Elm Street, with its white columns and manicured lawn, and stood in his father's study wondering what he'd become. He was Thomas Garrett, engaged to be married in 4 months, lying to his fiancée while dressed as a poor carpenter. He was also Jack Morrison, falling in love with a woman who seemed more real, more herself, when she forgot to maintain her society smile. The guilt should have stopped him. Instead, it drove him back to the Bluebird the next day, Thursday this time, when Caroline wasn't supposed to be there. But she was. Sitting in his booth, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her, staring out the window at the grey November sky. "I'm sorry," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. She looked at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "My fiancé and I had a fight last night about the wedding. He wants the reception at the country club. I wanted something smaller, more intimate. He said I was being difficult." She laughed without humor. "Maybe I am. Maybe I've always been difficult, and I just never noticed before." Thomas felt his heart split open. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything, to promise he'd listen to her about the wedding and everything else. But Jack Morrison said, "You're not difficult. You're just honest about what you want. That's rare." "Is it?" She stirred her coffee absently. "Sometimes I think honesty is the most expensive luxury there is. More expensive than the 4-tier cake or the string quartet or the dress my mother's been planning since I was 12. "You could call it off," he said, and the words tasted like ashes. "Could I?" She met his eyes. "You don't understand what it's like here, the expectations. My family has been intertwined with his family for 3 generations. Calling off this wedding wouldn't just be breaking an engagement, it would be breaking a contract, a betrayal. Would it be worse than marrying someone you're not sure you love?" The question hung between them like smoke. Caroline's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I don't know anymore. I used to be sure. When Thomas proposed, I said yes because it made sense, because I'd been raised to say yes, because—" She stopped, shook her head. "Because I didn't know there could be something else." "What else?" he asked, though he knew. God help him. He knew. "This," she whispered. "Sitting in a diner on a Thursday afternoon, talking to a stranger who sees me, really sees me, not the idea of me." She stood abruptly, grabbing her coat. "I can't do this. Whatever this is, I can't." She was gone before he could respond, the bell above the door chiming her exit. Thomas sat alone in the booth, surrounded by the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and understood that he'd created something terrible and true. Caroline Whitmore didn't love Thomas Garrett. Not really, not beyond the careful affection of shared history and social expectation. But she was beginning to love Jack Morrison, a man who didn't exist, who was nothing more than a lie wrapped in denim and good intentions. The rational thing would have been to end it. To shave the beard, put away the work clothes, resume his life as Thomas, and marry Caroline with the full knowledge that their love was exactly what he'd feared. Real enough for society, too hollow for the heart. But Thomas Garrett had spent 28 years being rational. He'd taken over his father's business at 26. He'd courted Caroline Whitmore with the patience of a man closing a merger. He'd attended church every Sunday, and Rotary Club every Tuesday, and the Chamber of Commerce dinner every third Thursday. He'd been rational, responsible, respectable, and he'd been miserable. So instead of ending it, he went deeper. He took a job at the new housing development, actually swinging a hammer and pulling nails, learning the rhythm of manual labor. His hands developed calluses. His back ached in new places. The other workers called him Jack, clapped him on the shoulder, invited him for beers at McGinty's Tavern, where Thomas Garrett had never set foot. He started living a double life in earnest, Thomas by morning, Jack by afternoon and evening. He'd leave the mill at noon, change clothes in the truck, and spend the rest of the day as someone else. It was exhausting, exhilarating, unsustainable. And it was working. Caroline started coming to the construction site, bringing water for the crew, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She'd talk to all the men, but her eyes would find Jack. They'd steal moments, a conversation behind a stack of lumber, a shared cigarette during break, once a walk through the half-finished houses at sunset, their footsteps echoing on plywood floors. "Thomas wants to honeymoon in Niagara Falls," she told him one evening, standing in what would someday be someone's living room. "It's where his parents went. He's already made reservations." "Where would you want to go?" Jack asked. "Somewhere I've never been. Somewhere that doesn't have a history already written for me." She touched an exposed wall stud, her fingers tracing the grain. "When I was little, I used to dream about Paris. Stupid, right? Small-town girl wanting to see the Eiffel Tower. It's not stupid." He moved closer, close enough to smell her perfume mixing with sawdust and autumn air. "You should see Paris. You should see everywhere you want to see." "Should I?" She turned to face him, and the dying light made her eyes look darker, sadder. "That's not how life works for women like me, Jack. We don't get to chase dreams. We get to marry well and host dinner parties and join the right committees and pretend that's enough." "Is it enough? For you?" "No," she said, and the word broke something open between them. God help me, no. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. Later he wouldn't remember who moved first, only that it happened and felt like falling and flying simultaneously. Her hands fisted in his jacket, and he pulled her closer, tasting coffee and regret and desperate hunger on her lips. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she was crying. "I'm engaged," she said. "I know. This is wrong. I know. I should leave. Probably." But she didn't leave. She kissed him again, harder this time, and he backed her against the rough framing, careful of nails and sharp edges, thinking about nothing but the reality of her body against his, the sound of her breathing, the way she whispered his name, Jack's name, like a prayer or a curse. They didn't let it go further. Some last thread of conscience or fear held them back. But when she finally did leave, climbing into her father's Cadillac and driving away into the November dusk, Thomas stood in that half-built house and knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He was in love with his fiancée, and she was in love with a man who didn't exist. The investigation began with a phone call. Margaret Chen, Caroline's closest friend from finishing school, called the Garrett house on a Tuesday evening. Thomas's housekeeper, Mrs. Walsh, answered and came to find him in the study. "It's Miss Chen, Mr. Garrett. She says it's urgent." Thomas took the phone, confusion prickling at the back of his neck. Margaret had never called him before. She communicated with Caroline, not with him directly. "Thomas," Margaret's voice was tight, professionally concerned, "we need to talk about Caroline." His stomach dropped. "Is she all right?" "That depends on what you mean by all right. Physically, she's fine. Emotionally," Margaret paused. "She's been different lately, distracted. She missed our lunch yesterday, just completely forgot. That's not like her." "I know she's been stressed about the wedding," Thomas said carefully. "It's more than stress. Last week I saw her car parked at that new development on Route 42, the construction site. When I asked her about it later, she said she'd been lost. But Thomas, she grew up here. She doesn't get lost." Another pause, heavier this time. "I think she might be seeing someone." The words hit like a fist to the chest, even though especially because he knew they were true. "That's impossible. Caroline wouldn't." "I'm not saying she would. I'm saying something is wrong, and as her fiancé, you should know. My cousin Phyllis works at the Bluebird Diner. She says Caroline's been spending time with one of the construction workers, a man named Jack Morrison. They talk for hours, Thomas. Phyllis says the way Caroline looks at him." She didn't finish the sentence. Thomas closed his eyes. The study suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. "Thank you for telling me, Margaret. I'll handle it." "I hope you will. Caroline's my friend, but she's making a terrible mistake if she's risking your engagement for some drifter with nice shoulders. Her reputation, her family's standing, everything would be ruined." After hanging up, Thomas sat in the green glow of his father's banker's lamp and tried to breathe. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? To know the truth, to test Caroline's love and find it wanting. Except now he knew that Caroline could love, deeply, recklessly, with the kind of abandon he'd always craved. She just couldn't love Thomas Garrett. She could only love Jack Morrison, the man he'd invented to prove she was shallow, materialistic, unworthy of his trust. Instead, he'd proven he was a liar and a coward who'd rather hide behind a false identity than risk genuine vulnerability. The next morning, Thomas woke to find his mother sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee Mrs. Walsh had prepared. Helen Garrett was 63, imperious, and still wore black even though her husband had been dead for 2 years. She set down her cup when Thomas entered. "We need to discuss your engagement," she said without preamble. "Mother, it's 6:30 in the morning. And you're usually at the mill by 6. Where were you yesterday afternoon?" "Not at work, apparently. Mr. Simmons called looking for you." Thomas poured himself coffee, buying time. "I had business to attend to." "What business?" "Thomas, you're acting strangely, secretive. You've been growing that ridiculous beard." "It's just a beard, Mother. Nothing is just anything in this town. People talk. They're already saying Caroline seems distracted, unhappy. If this wedding falls through, if there's a scandal, the damage to both families would be catastrophic. The Whitmores hold the land lease for the mill. Do you understand what could happen if relations soured?" "I understand perfectly," Thomas said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "I understand that my marriage is a business arrangement, that Caroline is an asset to be acquired like machinery or property. I understand that my feelings, her feelings, don't matter as long as the contract is honored." His mother's face went white. "How dare you? Your father and I had an arranged marriage, and we were very happy." "Were you?" The question came out quiet, dangerous. "Or did you just tell yourself that until you believed it. Helen stood, gathering her purse with trembling hands. I came here out of concern for you, for your future, but I see I'm wasting my time. When you're ready to remember who you are and what you owe this family, we'll speak again. She left, and Thomas sat alone in the kitchen as dawn light crept through the windows. Mrs. Walsh appeared, collected his mother's cup, and said nothing, but her silence felt like judgment. That evening, Thomas went to the construction site as Jack. He needed to see Caroline, to talk to her, though he had no idea what he would say. The sun was setting, painting the skeletal frames of half-built houses in shades of orange and red. Most of the crew had left, but he found Caroline's car parked near the foreman's trailer. She was sitting on the tailgate of someone's truck, wrapped in a wool coat, staring at nothing. When she saw him, she didn't smile. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "Caroline, Margaret knows. She saw my car here last week, and now she's asking questions. She called Thomas last night, told him I'm acting strange." Caroline laughed bitterly. "She's right. I am acting strange. I'm falling in love with a man I barely know while engaged to someone else. That's pretty strange." Thomas sat beside her on the tailgate, their shoulders not quite touching. "What did Thomas say?" "I don't know. I haven't talked to him. He left a message with my mother asking me to call him, but I can't. Not yet. Not when I don't know what to say." She turned to look at Jack, her eyes fierce and frightened. "Tell me this is real. Tell me I'm not inventing something just because I'm scared of my own life." "It's real," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Then what do we do? Because I can't keep lying. And I can't marry Thomas while feeling this way about you." "Would you leave him?" The question tasted like poison. "Would you break your engagement?" "I don't know." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "That's the truth, Jack. I don't know if I'm brave enough. Do you understand what it would mean? The scandal, the shame. My parents would be devastated. The whole town would talk. And for what? For a construction worker I've known for 6 weeks? For someone who might leave next month when the job's done?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and meant it in ways she couldn't understand. "You say that now, but you don't know what it's like here. The pressure, the expectations. Thomas and our families have been planning this union since we were children. Breaking that, betraying that, it would destroy everything. Even if it saves you. Saves me from what? A comfortable life, financial security, a husband who's kind and responsible. Maybe I'm just selfish, wanting more than that. Maybe I should be grateful for what I have, instead of chasing some fantasy of true love." Thomas wanted to tell her the truth then, wanted to rip off the beard and the work clothes and say, "I'm Thomas. I'm right here. We can have both. The security and the love, the society and the honesty." But what would that confession accomplish except reveal his own betrayal? She didn't love Thomas Garrett. She loved Jack Morrison. The truth wouldn't set them free. It would destroy them both. "You're not selfish," he said instead. "You're human. You want to feel seen. You want to matter beyond what you can provide for other people. That's not wrong, isn't it?" She wiped her eyes. "Maybe for you it's different. You don't have obligations, responsibilities. You can just drift from place to place, being whoever you want to be." The accusation stung because it was partly true. He had been playing at poverty, at freedom, treating Jack Morrison like a costume he could take off when it became inconvenient. But Caroline had been treating Thomas Garrett the same way, like a role she'd been assigned, lines she'd memorized without understanding what they meant. Before he could respond, headlights swept across the construction site. A black Chrysler pulled up and Thomas's heart stopped. He recognized that car, recognized the man who stepped out, his features sharp in the harsh light. Robert Whitmore, Caroline's father. "Caroline!" Robert called out, his voice carrying across the site. "Time to come home." Caroline slid off the tailgate, her face going blank in a way that broke Thomas's heart. This was the mask she wore, the society daughter resuming her position. "Father, I know what you were doing. Margaret Chen was kind enough to inform me." Robert's gaze cut to Thomas, to Jack, with cold assessment. "You, Morrison, you're fired. Be off this site by morning, and if you ever come near my daughter again, I'll make sure you never work in this county." "Father, you can't." "I can, and I will. Caroline, get in the car." "No." The word seemed to surprise everyone, including Caroline herself. She stood straighter, her voice stronger. "No, Father. I'm 26 years old. You can't order me around like a child." Robert's face darkened. "You're acting like a child. Do you have any idea what you're risking? Your engagement, your reputation, our family's standing, all for some vagrant who'll be gone before Christmas." "He's not a vagrant, he's—" Caroline stopped, seemed to gather herself. "He's someone who treats me like a person, not a possession." "And Thomas doesn't?" Robert's laugh was harsh. "Thomas Garrett, who's been nothing but patient and respectful, who's given you everything you could want. He doesn't treat you well?" "He treats me perfectly," Caroline said quietly. "That's the problem. He treats me like I'm perfect too, like I'm this porcelain figure to be placed on a shelf and admired. Jack treats me like I'm real." "Jack?" Robert turned his contempt on Thomas again. "Is that what you're calling yourself these days?" The words hit like a slap. Thomas froze, his mind racing. Does he know? How could he know? But Robert was just being cruel, dismissive. He turned back to Caroline. "If you don't get in that car right now, if you continue this embarrassing display, I will disinherit you. No trust fund, no allowance, nothing. You'll be cut off completely." Caroline went pale, but she didn't move toward the car. "Then I guess I'll have to learn to live without your money." "Fine," Robert's voice went cold, "but understand this. When you come crawling back, and you will, don't expect forgiveness. You're making your choice. Live with it." He got back in the Chrysler and drove away, leaving Caroline and Thomas alone in the gathering dark. Caroline was shaking, her breath coming in gasps. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What did I just do?" Thomas reached for her, but she stepped back. "Don't. If you touch me right now, I'll fall apart, and I can't. I need to think." "Caroline, I just threw away my entire life for you." She was crying again, but her voice stayed steady. "For a man I've known for 6 weeks, a man who's never even told me his real last name, it's Morrison, right? Or is that fake too?" The question landed like an arrow in his chest. "It's real," he lied, because what else could he say? "Is it? Because right now I don't know what's real anymore. My father just disowned me. My engagement is probably over. My friends will drop me. And for what? So I can be with a carpenter who might disappear tomorrow. I won't disappear. You don't know that. You don't know anything about what happens next, because neither of us has ever done something like this before." She grabbed her purse from the truck bed, her movements jerky with panic. "I need to go. I need to figure out where I'm even supposed to sleep tonight, because I sure as hell can't go home." "Stay with me," Thomas heard himself say. "Where? Do you even have a place? Or have you been living out of that truck?" He did have a place, the Garrett house on Elm Street, with its 4 bedrooms and library and servants' quarters. But Jack Morrison didn't. Jack Morrison lived in a rented room above McGinty's Tavern, a space Thomas had secured weeks ago for exactly this kind of emergency. It smelled of beer and cigarettes, had a single bed and a hot plate, and represented everything Caroline had just given up for him. "I have a room," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm, and it's safe." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, reassurance, certainty, proof that she hadn't just made the worst mistake of her life. Whatever she found there must have been enough, because she nodded. "All right," she said. "Take me there." They drove in silence, Caroline following in her Cadillac because she wouldn't leave it at the site. The drive to McGinty's was short, the town passing by in familiar shapes made strange by circumstance. Thomas parked the borrowed truck behind the tavern, and Caroline pulled in beside him. The room was exactly as terrible as he'd remembered. A cramped space with wallpaper peeling at the seams, a radiator that clanked and hissed, a single window overlooking the alley. Caroline stood in the doorway, taking it in, and Thomas watched her face for disgust or regret. Instead, she started to laugh. Not hysterically, but with a kind of exhausted wonder. "This is really happening. I'm really here." "You can leave," he said. "You can go back, apologize to your father, marry Thomas Garrett, and pretend this never happened." "Could I, though?" She set her purse on the rickety table. "Could I really pretend after this? After feeling something real for the first time in my life?" She crossed to him, put her hands on his chest. He could feel her trembling, or maybe he was the one shaking. When she kissed him, it tasted like salt and desperation. "I don't have anything," she whispered against his mouth. "No money, no family support, no plan. All I have is you." "That's all I have too," he said, and it was the truest thing he'd spoken in weeks. They held each other in that shabby room while the radiator clanked and the sounds of the tavern drifted up through the floor, laughter and arguments and the clink of glasses. Thomas stroked her hair and felt the weight of what they'd become. Two people who'd destroyed their lives for a love that was built on lies. He should tell her. He knew he should, but the words wouldn't come because telling her would mean losing her, and he'd just discovered he couldn't bear that loss. Around midnight, Caroline finally fell asleep on his narrow bed, still fully dressed, one hand curled under her cheek. Thomas sat in the room's only chair and watched her breathe. Tomorrow, he would need to make decisions. Tomorrow, the truth would start to emerge because truth always did in towns this small. Someone would see through his disguise, or Caroline would piece together the inconsistencies, or his mother would track him down. But tonight, in this moment, he let himself be Jack Morrison completely, a man with nothing to offer except honesty and love, a man who would give everything to protect the woman sleeping in his bed, even if it meant becoming the lie forever. The morning brought rain and reality in equal measure. Caroline woke disoriented, taking several seconds to remember where she was and why. Thomas, still dressed as Jack, had spent the night in the chair, dozing fitfully, his back aching from the awkward position. "Good morning," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Morning." He stood, joints popping. "There's a bathroom down the hall. It's shared, but it should be empty this early." She nodded, gathering herself with visible effort. When she'd gone, Thomas stared at his reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. The beard had grown fuller, hiding more of his face. His eyes looked different too, older, harder, marked by the weight of his choices. A knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find McGinty himself, a barrel-chested Irishman with a face like weathered leather. "Morning, Jack. Got a visitor downstairs asking for you. Man in a suit. Looks official." Thomas's stomach dropped. "Did he give a name?" "Nope. Just said he needed to speak with Jack Morrison right away. Want me to send him up?" "No, I'll come down." He found Margaret Chen's cousin's husband, David, waiting in the tavern's dim interior. David was a lawyer, one of 3 in Ashford, and the way he looked at Thomas suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Mr. Morrison," David said, though his tone made the name sound like an accusation, "we need to talk about Caroline Whitmore. She's upstairs. She's fine. Is she?" "Because her father came to my office first thing this morning, asking if he had grounds to have you arrested for kidnapping or corruption of morals or any other charge that might stick." David leaned against the bar, crossing his arms. "Now, I told Robert that Caroline is an adult and made her own choices. But he's angry, Mr. Morrison. angry enough to cause you serious problems. I haven't done anything illegal. Haven't you? David's eyes narrowed. See, here's the thing. I've been asking around about you. Jack Morrison, carpenter from Eastern Kentucky, looking for work. But nobody in Eastern Kentucky seems to have heard of you. No union membership. No previous employer willing to vouch for you. It's like you appeared out of nowhere 6 weeks ago. Thomas's pulse hammered in his throat. I kept to myself back home. Or maybe Jack Morrison doesn't exist at all. David pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and laid it on the bar. This is interesting. Picture from the Ashford Gazette, about 2 years old. Thomas Garrett at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the mill expansion. Now, he's clean-shaven in this photo, but look at the eyes, the shape of the face, the way he carries himself. The photograph showed Thomas in a suit, smiling beside the mayor. Even with the beard, the resemblance was undeniable if you knew to look for it. You think I'm Thomas Garrett? Thomas forced a laugh. That's insane. Is it? Because I think Thomas Garrett, feeling trapped by his engagement and his obligations, decided to test his fiancée, create a false identity, see if she'd stay loyal. Except it backfired. She fell for the fake identity, and now he doesn't know how to come clean without destroying everything. David pocketed the photo. Am I warm? The truth sat on Thomas's tongue like poison. Before he could decide whether to swallow it or spit it out, Caroline appeared at the top of the stairs. Jack? She called down. Is everything all right? David's expression shifted, not quite pity but close. You need to tell her, he said quietly, before someone else does, because the truth is coming out one way or another, and she deserves to hear it from you. He left, and Thomas stood frozen in the tavern's morning light. Caroline descended the stairs, her hair still mussed from sleep, wearing yesterday's clothes. She looked young and vulnerable, and completely trusting. Who was that? Now she asked. A lawyer. Your father sent him. Fear flashed across her face. What did he want? To threaten me, to scare me off. Thomas took a breath. Caroline, we need to talk. About what? Everything. About how he'd lied from the beginning. About how Jack Morrison was a costume he wore to hide from the truth. About how he was Thomas Garrett, the man she was supposed to marry, and he'd been testing her love like some twisted experiment. But before he could speak, the tavern door opened and Helen Garrett walked in, imperious even in this dive bar setting. Her eyes found Thomas immediately, really saw him past the beard and the work clothes, and her face went white. Thomas, she said, his real name echoing in the space. What have you done? Caroline's head whipped around, looking between them in confusion. Thomas, your name is Jack. No, Helen said, her voice like a blade. His name is Thomas Edmund Garrett. He's my son. And he's been lying to you. The color drained from Caroline's face. She stepped back, one hand reaching for the stair railing as if she might fall. What? I can explain, Thomas said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Explain what? Caroline's voice was rising, shaking. That you've been pretending to be someone else? That Jack Morrison doesn't exist? That I just threw away my entire life for a man who was lying to me from the start? I wanted to know if what we had was real. Real? She laughed, a terrible sound. You wanted to know if it was real, so you lied? You created a fake person and made me fall in love with him? You did fall in love, he said desperately. That's real, Caroline. What you feel, what I feel is what Jack Morrison made me feel. The carpenter with calloused hands and no money and no expectations. The man who saw me as a person, not a prize. But that man doesn't exist, does he? He never existed. It was just Thomas Garrett, the man I was engaged to, playing dress-up. Caroline, did you laugh? Her eyes were fierce with tears and rage. When I told you about my problems with my fiancé, about how he didn't listen to me, Did you laugh at how stupid I was, how I couldn't even recognize my own fiancé when he grew a beard? I never laughed. Thomas reached for her, but she jerked away. Don't touch me. Don't you dare. She turned to Helen. Did you know? Were you all in on this sick joke? I had no idea until this moment, Helen said, her voice tight with fury directed at her son. Thomas, you need to fix this now. How? Caroline demanded. How does he fix this? I destroyed my relationship with my father for a lie. I gave up everything I had for someone who doesn't exist. How do you fix that? She pushed past them both, running for the door. Thomas started to follow, but Helen grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Let her go, she said. You've done enough damage. Thomas shook her off and ran after Caroline, but she was already in her Cadillac, engine roaring to life. He reached her window just as she started to pull away. Caroline, please. You want to know the worst part? She looked at him, and the devastation in her eyes nearly broke him. The worst part is that I still love Jack. Even knowing he's not real, even knowing you created him to manipulate me, I still love that made-up person more than I've ever loved you. And that's the truth you were so desperate to find. Congratulations, Thomas. You got your answer. She drove away, tires squealing on wet pavement. Thomas stood in the rain and watched her go, feeling the full weight of what he'd destroyed. Behind him, his mother said, "Come home. We need to discuss how to contain this." But Thomas didn't move. He stood in the rain until he was soaked through, until the cold numbed his skin, if not his guilt, thinking about how he'd set out to test Caroline's love and ended up revealing his own cowardice instead. The truth was out now, and the truth was uglier than any lie he'd told. Thomas hadn't been home to the Garrett house in 3 days. He stayed in the room above McGinty's, a penance, or maybe just an inability to leave the last place where Jack Morrison had felt real. The construction job had ended, not because he was fired, but because he'd stopped showing up. His mother called twice daily. He didn't answer. On the 4th morning, he finally dragged himself to the mill. The workers stared but said nothing, which was somehow worse than accusations would have been. His assistant, Mr. Simmons, handed him a stack of papers that needed signing and a copy of the Ashford Gazette. The front page featured a small article, bottom corner, Garrett engagement in question following mystery scandal. The piece was short on details but long on innuendo, suggesting that Caroline Whitmore had been seen in compromising situations with a local labourer, and that Thomas Garrett's unusual recent behaviour had created questions about the wedding's future. "Mr. Simmons," Thomas said, setting down the paper, "what's being said around town?" The older man adjusted his glasses uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm not sure. Please, I need to know." Simmons sighed. "The story people are telling is that you hired someone to test Miss Whitmore's fidelity. When she failed, you called off the engagement. There's respect for that among some folks. Others think you're a fool who got what he deserved." He paused. "And there's a third group that believes you fell in love with your own deception and broke both your hearts. Which group is right?" "In my experience, sir, when everyone's telling a different story, the truth is usually worse than any of them imagine." Thomas couldn't disagree. He spent the day signing papers, making decisions he barely registered, going through the motions of being the man who ran Garrett Manufacturing, but his mind was elsewhere, on Caroline, on the damage he'd caused, on whether there was any path forward that didn't end in ruins. At lunch, Margaret Chen appeared in his office unannounced, bypassing his secretary with the kind of authority that came from old money and absolute certainty. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "If you're here to tell me I'm terrible, save your breath, I already know." "I'm not here to tell you you're terrible. I'm here to tell you that Caroline is worse." Margaret sat down without being invited. "She's staying at my house. She won't eat. She barely sleeps. She just sits in the guest room staring at nothing. Her father won't speak to her. Her mother calls crying every day. And you're hiding in your mill like a coward. What would you have me do? She made it clear she doesn't want to see me. She made it clear she's heartbroken. There's a difference. Margaret leaned forward. Let me tell you what I know about Caroline Whitmore. She's been performing her entire life. The perfect daughter, the perfect debutante, the perfect fiancée. She was so good at performing that she convinced herself the performance was real, until you showed up as Jack Morrison and gave her permission to stop pretending. I was pretending too. That's the problem. Was it, though? Margaret's eyes were sharp. Or were you being more honest as Jack Morrison than you ever were as Thomas Garrett? Because from what Caroline's told me, Jack Morrison listened. He asked questions. He saw her as a full person, not a trophy to be won or a problem to be solved. Was that the lie, Thomas? Or was the lie the man you were before? The question hit like a punch. Thomas stood, pacing to the window. I don't know anymore. Then figure it out. Because Caroline is downstairs in my car, and she's been sitting there for 20 minutes trying to decide if she's brave enough to come up. Margaret stood. I'll give you both some privacy. But Thomas, if you hurt her again, old family friendship be damned, I'll destroy you myself. She left, and Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched through the window until he saw Caroline emerge from Margaret's car, her movements hesitant, almost fragile. She wore a simple blue dress, no jewelry, her hair pulled back. She looked smaller than he remembered. He met her at the office door before she could knock. Caroline. Hello, Thomas. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Can we talk? Of course, please, come in. She entered, looking around his office as if seeing it for the first time, and maybe she was. Caroline Whitmore had never visited Garrett Manufacturing. She'd never needed to understand how Thomas spent his days or what his work meant to him. They'd existed in the spaces where their lives were supposed to intersect, dinner parties, church, family gatherings, the places where they could perform their relationship for an audience. Nice office, she said, though her tone suggested she found it sad rather than impressive. Thank you. He gestured to a chair, but she remained standing. Margaret said you wanted to see me. I'm not sure wanted is the right word. Needed, maybe. I have questions, and I think I deserve answers. She met his eyes. Why did you do it? And don't tell me it was to test my love, because that's too simple. There's more to it than that. Thomas sank into his desk chair, suddenly exhausted. You're right, there is more. He gestured to the office around them. I've been running this mill since I was 26. My father died, and I stepped into his shoes, because that's what Garretts do. We take care of the business, we marry well, we maintain the family legacy. I never questioned it because questioning would have been selfish. Go on. But then we got engaged, and I realized I didn't know you. Not really. We'd been dating for 2 years, and I could tell you what perfume you wore and how you liked your coffee, but I had no idea what you dreamed about, what scared you, what you wanted beyond the life everyone expected you to want. He paused, searching for words. I created Jack Morrison because I needed to know if there was something real between us, something beyond the performance. And you found out there wasn't. No. He stood, closing the distance between them carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. I found out that I'd been performing too, that I'd been so busy being the man I thought I was supposed to be that I forgot to find out who I actually was. Jack Morrison wasn't a disguise, Caroline. He was me without the weight of expectations, without the fear of disappointing my father's memory, or losing the mill, or breaking some unspoken family code. So which one is real? Her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas or Jack? Both, neither, I don't know anymore. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture frustrated, exhausted. All I know is that when I was with you as Jack, I felt alive for the first time in years. And that terrifies me, because it means I've been half dead this whole time without even realizing it. Caroline was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. I was half dead too, she finally said, playing the role everyone expected. The dutiful daughter, the perfect fiancée. I was so good at it that I convinced myself it was enough. But it wasn't. It was killing me slowly, and I didn't even know it until Jack Morrison asked me what I wanted, and I realized I'd never asked myself that question. "What do you want?" Thomas asked. "I don't know. That's what I've been trying to figure out for the past 4 days." She moved to the window, looking out at the mill-yard below. "I know I don't want to go back to who I was before. I can't. But I also don't know if I can trust you again. You lied to me, Thomas, about everything. Not everything. My feelings were real, are real." Which feelings? Thomas's feelings for his appropriate fiancée, or Jack's feelings for the woman he met in a diner? She turned back to face him, because those feel like two different things. Before Thomas could answer, his secretary knocked urgently. "Mr. Garrett, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation. Your mother is here with Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. They're demanding to see you immediately." Thomas and Caroline exchanged a look of shared dread. "Send them in," he said. The door opened, and Helen Garrett entered first, followed by Robert and Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor looked like she'd been crying for days. Robert looked like he wanted to commit murder. Helen just looked coldly furious. "Caroline," Eleanor said, rushing toward her daughter. "Thank God. We've been so worried." "Don't touch me," Caroline said, stepping back. "You sided with Father. You let him disown me without saying a word. What was I supposed to do? You were throwing your life away for some vagrant." "He's not a vagrant," Caroline said. "He's Thomas Garrett, my fiancé, or he was. I'm not sure anymore what he is." Robert's face went purple. "You knew?" he demanded, rounding on Thomas. "You knew she was sneaking around with some construction worker, and that construction worker was you. I created Jack Morrison to test whether Caroline and I had a real foundation for marriage," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to know if she loved me for who I am or for what I represent. And you thought lying to her was the way to find that out?" Helen's voice could have cut glass. "You thought deception and manipulation would somehow reveal truth. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Robert's laugh was harsh. "You humiliated my daughter. You made her choose between her family and a fiction. You destroyed her reputation for your own selfish experiment." "Her reputation!" Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sudden. "You're worried about her reputation, not her happiness, not her feelings, just what the neighbors will say. Don't you dare lecture me about my daughter. She's not property." Thomas's voice rose. "She's not a business asset or a social accessory. She's a person with her own dreams and desires, and maybe, if you'd ever asked her what those were instead of just telling her what to want, none of this would have happened." The room went silent. Eleanor gasped. Robert looked like he might actually strike Thomas. Helen closed her eyes as if in pain. Caroline was staring at Thomas with an expression he couldn't read. "How dare you?" Robert said quietly, dangerously. "After what you've done, how dare you criticize how I've raised my daughter?" "Because I'm just as guilty," Thomas said. "I did the exact same thing. I saw Caroline as something to be tested, verified, approved. I never just asked her what she wanted. I never trusted her or myself enough to be honest." He looked at Caroline. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," Robert said. "The wedding is off. The engagement is over. And if you come near my daughter again—" "Father, stop." Caroline's voice was quiet, but firm. "Just stop. Caroline, you can't possibly still want to marry him after—" "I don't know what I want to do about Thomas," she interrupted. "But I know I'm done letting other people make my decisions for me. I'm done performing. I'm done pretending." She looked at her father. "You disowned me. You said if I left with Jack, I was dead to you. Do you remember that? I was angry. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to control me. There's a difference." Her voice shook but didn't break. "I love you, Father, but I can't be who you want me to be anymore. I have to figure out who I actually am." Eleanor was crying openly now. "What does that mean? What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." Caroline turned to Thomas. "Can we talk? Alone?" Helen, Robert and Eleanor began to protest simultaneously, but Caroline held up a hand. "Please, just give us some privacy. 30 minutes. Then we'll tell you what we've decided." Reluctantly, the parents filed out. Helen was the last to leave, pausing at the door. "Thomas, whatever you decide, make sure it's honest this time. No more lies, no more games." When they were alone, Caroline sank into a chair. "This is a disaster. I know. My father hates you. Your mother is furious. The whole town is talking. Margaret says the story in the Gazette is just the beginning. Apparently there are reporters from Lexington asking questions." She laughed without humor. "We're a scandal." "We don't have to be." Thomas pulled up a chair across from her. "We could fix this, get married as planned, present a united front, let people think it was just a misunderstanding. In 6 months, everyone would forget." "Would they? Would we?" She met his eyes. "Could you forget that I fell in love with someone else? Could I forget that someone else was you in disguise?" "I don't want to forget," he said. "I want to understand it. Caroline, when you were with Jack, you were different, more open, more honest. You laughed more. You talked about your dreams. Because I thought Jack wouldn't judge me. I thought he didn't have expectations. I didn't. I don't." Thomas leaned forward. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. Being Jack Morrison showed me that I don't want the life everyone expects me to want either. I don't want the country club wedding and the honeymoon in Niagara Falls and the carefully planned future. I want something real. But you're still Thomas Garrett. You still run the mill. You still have responsibilities." "I do, but that doesn't mean I have to live my father's life. I can run the mill and still be myself. I can be Thomas Garrett and the man who asks you what you dream about." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "What I can't do is pretend anymore. And I won't ask you to pretend either." Caroline's fingers tightened around his. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too. What if we try this, really try, honestly, and it doesn't work? Then at least we'll know the truth, the real truth, not some test or performance." He paused. "But Caroline, I have to ask, can you forgive me? Not today, maybe, but eventually." She was quiet for a long time, and in that silence, Thomas heard the mill machinery humming below, the clock on the wall ticking, the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. All the ordinary sounds of his ordinary life, the life he'd been trying to escape or test or understand. "I don't know," Caroline finally said, "but I'm willing to try, because the truth is, I miss Jack. And I think I could love Thomas too, if Thomas is willing to be as honest as Jack was." "More honest," Thomas promised. "No more lies, no more disguises. Just me, whoever that turns out to be." "And we tell everyone the truth? The whole truth?" He took a breath. "Yes, let me handle it." And they walked out of his office together, hand in hand, to face their parents. The conversation that followed was painful. Accusations, tears, recriminations. But Thomas held firm, explaining his deception, accepting responsibility, and making clear that he and Caroline needed time to figure out their relationship without family pressure. "We're postponing the wedding," he announced, "not cancelling. Postponing. Caroline and I need to learn who we are, separately and together, before we can promise forever." "Postpone for how long?" Eleanor asked tremulously. "As long as it takes," Caroline said, and her voice was stronger than Thomas had ever heard it. Rebuilding from truth. The weeks that followed were strange and difficult. Thomas shaved his beard, which felt like shedding a skin. Caroline moved into Margaret's guest house, establishing independence from both her parents and from Thomas. They saw each other, but carefully. Coffee at the Bluebird, walks through the construction site where it had all started, long conversations that sometimes ended in arguments and sometimes in fragile understanding. The town gossip was vicious at first. The scandal had everything small communities loved: wealth, deception, forbidden love, family drama. But something unexpected happened. Some of the mill workers, men who'd known Jack Morrison, started telling their own version of the story, about how the boss had worked alongside them, really worked, and listened to their concerns about wages and safety, about how he'd seemed like a regular guy, not some privileged heir. Thomas Garrett got his hands dirty for once, one worker told a reporter from the Lexington paper. Maybe he had the wrong reasons for doing it, but he learned something. You can see it in how he runs things now. It was true. Thomas had started making changes at the mill, safety improvements, better pay, listening to workers' suggestions instead of just issuing orders from his office. Being Jack Morrison had taught him something about the people who actually built things, who worked with their hands, who lived paycheck to paycheck. He couldn't unknow that now. Caroline, meanwhile, was painting. She'd rented a small studio above the hardware store and spent her days creating the landscapes she'd always dreamed about. Some were Kentucky scenes, the autumn hills, the mill at sunset, the construction site where her life had changed. Others were imagined: Paris streets, ocean vistas, places she'd never been but hoped to see. "They're beautiful," Thomas said, visiting her studio on a grey December afternoon. "You should show them. They're private." "Why? You're talented, Caroline. People should see this." She set down her brush, wiping her hands on a paint-stained cloth. "Because they're mine. Not my father's daughter's paintings or Thomas Garrett's fiancée's hobby. Mine. Then show them as yours, as Caroline Whitmore, artist, not as anyone's daughter or fiancée, just you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that who you want to marry? Just me, without all the family connections and social standing?" "That's exactly who I want to marry, if you'll still have me." "I don't know yet," she said, but she was smiling. "Ask me again in the spring." Christmas came, awkward and tense. Caroline had a tentative reconciliation with her mother, though her father still refused to speak to her directly. Thomas spent Christmas dinner with his mother, who had slowly, grudgingly begun to understand what her son had been trying to tell her. "Your father would be disappointed," Helen said over turkey and cranberry sauce. Would he, or would he understand? Thomas set down his fork. "Mother, did you love father? Really love him?" Helen's face softened in a way he rarely saw. "Eventually, it grew over time. But Thomas, I also learned to be content with what I had, with duty and respect and partnership. Love wasn't the point." "Maybe it should have been." "Maybe," she admitted, "but it's too late for me to know what might have been. It's not too late for you." The new year brought change. In January, the Ashford Library hosted Caroline's first art show. She'd been terrified no one would come, that the scandal would keep people away. Instead, the opening was packed. Mill workers stood next to country club members, all studying her paintings. By the end of the night, she'd sold 3 pieces and received commissions for 4 more. Thomas watched from across the room, proud and awed. This was Caroline without the mask, Caroline being fully herself, and she was magnificent. In February, Robert Whitmore appeared at the mill, unannounced. Thomas's secretary tried to stop him, but Robert pushed past. "We need to talk," he said, closing the office door. "If you're here to threaten me again..." "I'm here to apologize." The words seemed to cost Robert something, his face tight with the effort. "I've been watching Caroline these past months. She's different, happier, more alive. I didn't realize how much of herself she'd been hiding." Thomas waited, saying nothing. "I blamed you for that," Robert continued. for making her question everything, for disrupting the life we'd planned for her. But Eleanor, help me understand something. He paused, looking older than Thomas had ever seen him. We raised Caroline to be obedient, compliant. We never taught her to want things for herself. We were so focused on giving her the right life that we never asked if it was the life she wanted. Mr. Whitmore, let me finish. Robert held up a hand. What you did was wrong. The deception, the manipulation, it was wrong, but it broke something open that needed breaking. Caroline needed to discover who she is beyond what we taught her to be. And maybe you needed the same thing. I did, Thomas admitted, so I'm here to say that if you and Caroline decide to marry, you have my blessing. Not because I forgive you, or because I think this is the match I would have chosen, but because she's chosen it, and I'm finally learning to let her make her own choices. He extended his hand. I'm also here to discuss the mill lease. Whether or not you marry my daughter, our families should have a business relationship built on fair terms, not coercion. Thomas shook his hand, relief flooding through him. Thank you, sir. After Robert left, Thomas sat in his father's chair, his chair now, really, and felt something settle in his chest. Forgiveness, progress, the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust. March brought rain and the first green shoots of spring. Thomas drove out to the construction site, now a completed development of small, modest homes. He and Caroline had started meeting there sometimes, walking through the streets that had witnessed their transformation. Do you remember the first time you came here? He asked, as they stood in front of the house where they'd first kissed, bringing water to the crew. I was looking for Jack, she said. I'd convinced myself I was doing charity work, but really I just wanted to see him. See me. I'll see you, she agreed, the you that you were afraid to be as yourself. I'm not afraid anymore. He turned to face her. Caroline Whitmore, artist, dreamer, woman who's braver than I'll ever be. Will you marry me? Not because our families expect it, not because it makes social sense, but because I love you, the real you, and I want to spend my life discovering more of who that is. She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. You're supposed to have a ring when you propose. I do. He pulled a small box from his pocket. But it's not the ring I gave you before. That ring was my grandmother's. Tradition, expectation, all the things we're trying to move past. This one I chose myself. It's smaller, simpler, but it's honest. He opened the box. The ring inside was a simple gold band with a single small sapphire. Blue like the dresses she wore, blue like the paint on her fingers, blue like the Kentucky sky in autumn. Caroline took the ring, slipping it on her finger. Yes, she said, yes, I'll marry you, but Thomas. Yeah? I want to honeymoon in Paris. He laughed, pulling her close. Then Paris it is. Paris and anywhere else you've ever dreamed of going. They married in May, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church. Not the grand affair originally planned, but something intimate. Close friends, family who'd learned to accept their choices, mill workers who'd known Jack Morrison, and artists who'd met Caroline at her shows. Margaret was maid of honor. Mr. Simmons stood as Thomas's best man. During the vows, Caroline spoke words they'd written together. I promise to see you as you are, not as I want you to be. To grow with you, not just beside you. To choose you every day, honestly and completely. Thomas responded, I promise never to hide from you again. To trust you with my real self, my fears and dreams and flaws. To build a life with you that's ours, not anyone else's idea of what it should be. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause. Thomas pulled back just enough to whisper, Hello, Mrs. Garrett. Hello, Mr. Morrison, she whispered back, and they both laughed. The reception was held at the mill. transformed for the day, with lights strung between the buildings, tables set up in the yard, music from a local band that played both country and rock and roll. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. Workers danced with debutantes. Helen Garrett shared a table with Robert and Eleanor Whitmore, the families finally finding common ground. As the sun set, Thomas and Caroline stood at the edge of the celebration, watching their two worlds merge into one. "No regrets?" he asked. "Only that it took so long to get here," she said, "to find out who we really are. We're still figuring that out. I know, but at least we're figuring it out together, honestly this time." He kissed her forehead. "Together and honestly. I can live with that." They left for Paris 3 days later, beginning an adventure that would take them through France, Italy, and eventually back home to Kentucky, but a different Kentucky than the one they'd left. They returned not as the people they'd been expected to be, but as the people they'd discovered themselves to be. Flawed, honest, still learning, still growing. Thomas continued running the mill, but differently, with input from workers, with compassion and innovation, building something his father would have respected even if he wouldn't have understood it. Caroline opened a gallery in Ashford, showing not just her own work, but that of other local artists who'd never had a platform. And sometimes on Wednesday afternoons, they'd meet at the Bluebird Diner, sit in the same booth where it all started, and remember the man who didn't exist, but taught them both how to be real. Years later, when people asked how they'd overcome the scandal, the lies that nearly destroyed engagement, Thomas would say, "We stopped trying to be who we thought we should be and started being who we actually were." And Caroline would add, "We learned that the truth, no matter how messy, is always better than the most beautiful lie." They built their marriage on that foundation. Truth, growth, honest love earned through hardship and choice. It wasn't perfect. They argued, struggled, made mistakes, but they never hid from each other again. They never performed for an audience or wore masks to make their lives easier. They were just Thomas and Caroline, two people who'd tested love and found it wanting, until they learned that real love doesn't need to be tested at all. It just needs to be chosen, every day, with clear eyes and open hearts. And that, in the end, was the happiest ending they could have asked for. Not perfection, but truth. Not destiny, but choice. Not the life they were supposed to want, but the life they built together, one honest day at a time.